like types of life. And that's what we're advocating. The stasis of essential types of life, for example, humans and horses. So I have a whole chapter on this in Is a Young Earth Possible? You can just search Young Earth Possible on Amazon, and you could also go to my website, totalyouth.us. That's totalyouth.us. And there's a few things we want to bring out. Is one of my old pictures, about maybe a year and a half, and I know a fish when I saw one. So ask any 3-year-old, they know a fish when they see one. So I'm going to grab my humongous book here, and it's the 1755 dictionary from Samuel Johnson. I'm going to look up a couple words here. One is aloe, and on the second definition we have a tree which grows in hot countries and even in the mountains of Spain. The leaves are thick, succulent, and generally beset with spines on the edges. The flower consists of one leaf, is tubulous and cut into 6 segments at the top, like the hyacinth. The fruit is oblong and cylindrical, divided into 3 cells, and containing flat, and for the most part, semicircular seeds. So it gives a description of aloe. Of course, we're probably more familiar with aloe vera, and it's good for the skin, all that kind of stuff. So it gives a clear definition. So there's distinct kinds of plants, there are distinct kinds of animals. I also wanted to look at another one out of here, out of Samuel Johnson's dictionary, and it's baboon. And it says, a monkey of the largest kind. Well, that was Samuel Johnson's statement on it, but it gives a couple of quotes here. You had looked through the grate like a Gemini of baboons. And that's from Shakespeare. And then it says, he cast every human feature out of his countenance and became a baboon, from Addison. So it gives a distinction there between humans and baboons, which is kind of cool there. So one book I have here, it's pretty cool. It's from the most well-known Islamic anti-evolutionist, and I'm going to go through a few examples here and look at some of these critters. And so here we have crinoid, or sea lily, and it is supposedly 345 million years old. So for that length of time, it's stayed a sea lily. And it hasn't changed, so maybe indefinitely, and it never has changed. It's always been a sea lily. So that's the view of biological essentialism that I'm presenting. Here's a sequoia branch, and it's supposedly 50 million years old. So that is, again, it stayed the same. It's always been a sequoia. Again, some of them get to be really old, like thousands of years. And here we go, a grasshopper. And it's supposedly 125 million years old, and that is obviously a long time to be the same thing. A grasshopper. It never evolved to anything different or evolved from something else. And then we have something that's supposedly 167 million years old, the Chambered Nautilus, and that was discovered not in the too distant past. That it was still around with us, a living, so-called living fossil. And there's a whole bunch of these in here, and there's tons of examples in different things. There's a brown bear, supposedly 90 million years old, the skull, and so it's always been a bear, didn't come from something else or go into something else. So we're investigating the animals that stay the same for long periods of time. And towards the back there was a conference in Turkey, and there in the second spot is my good friend John Morris. So there you go. And a lot of these come from all sorts of different places around the world. Just has picture after picture. It's a pretty cool book to get. And I wanted to show you at least one of these bugs. Here's a fly, supposedly 25 million years old, but notice it's an amber. So my book argues for a young earth. What's the connection? Well, in some of the amber you actually find DNA, which of course decays pretty fast, and so it kind of brings up the dating issue and how in the world is that possible. What about genetics? How does that relate to this? Well, the father of genetics, Gregor Mendel, actually rejected evolution. What does genetics basically tell us? There's variation, but it has within a limit. So that's the key thing. So if you do some study on this, you might could think of the philosophy of biology. And here's a word cloud from stock photo, or can stock rather, and it doesn't even have essentialism on there, but sometimes that happens. A good source for more info is episode of In Our Time with Melvin Bragg, and it's on Aristotle's biology, and you can check that out. A couple of books I'd like to recommend is Aristotle's Revenge, Edward Feser, and David Oderberg, Real Essentialism. They don't have exactly my same perspective, but they're somewhat close. Now we're going to talk about Colin Patterson here in a bit, and he was at the British Museum of Natural History, edited its journal, and wrote a book with the title Evolution. And he is actually highlighted in the Open University's class on systematics, which means you're classifying animals and plants. And here's kind of the introduction on it, and I want to read this. To the layperson, it might seem surprising that there is any problem with the recognition of higher taxa. The very existence of long-established vernacular names for inclusive groupings of species, e.g., finches, thrushes, parrots, and hawks, are distinct groups of birds, suggests that higher taxa are self-evident, and that's the key point I'm trying to bring out. Like a 3-year-old can tell the difference between a parrot and a pirate. Aye, mateys. And so that's the thing. It does seem to be self-evident that there are distinct kinds, and that one didn't come from the other. Now, if you do want to delve into this a little more, you can look up Phil Papers, short for .org, short for philosophy, and the topic would be Essentialism about Species, and you find tons of papers from that. Now let's look at the distinction between us and the lower primates. So if we look at the ape spine versus the human spine, on the human spine you can see that there's actually 4 turning points and 3 inflection points, so apparently we are actually different. And what about some quotes? Let's look at this. This is Colin Patterson, and from a paper he published in New Scientist. Now he's describing the traditional view of biological essentialism, not necessarily that he's advocating it. So quote, Linnaeus and his successors recognized genera, families, and other categories on the basis of similarities in structure, believed that each group had a set of features that were its essence, or ideal plan corresponding to something in the mind of the creator. Comparative anatomy developed as a means of searching out these ideal plans, unquote. So there you go. Essentialism, you have definite categories. There's variation within those categories, but they have definite limits. That's the basic idea. So I like to use the term essential types of life, retails, and so those are static but within limits, that they vary. Okay, a book that Colin Patterson edited was Molecules and the Morphology and Evolution. Timothy Rowe wrote one chapter, and he had this to say, not to be confused with micro, that's dirty jobs. And so he said this, quote, Morphology, an intriguing picture develops in this volume with molecular and morphological phylogenies sometimes agree and sometimes not. There is a general agreement that both molecular and morphological phylogenetics face similar fundamental problems, and that a touchstone has not been found, unquote. So that was Timothy Rowe realizing that when you look at the molecular aspects of different living things, they don't match up to just looking at the form and the structure. And so there's conflicts there. So the easy solution is they didn't evolve, they have been distinct through time. Another paper that's pretty cool, it came from the book Carving Nature at Its Joints. It came out from MIT. The authors are Slater and Borghini. And they're describing the background in Plato. Quote, Plato famously employed the carving metaphor as an analogy for the reality of forms. Like an animal, the world comes to us pre-divided. Ideally, our best theories will be those that carve nature at its joints, as Plato referenced. While Plato employed the metaphor to convey this view about reality of forms, its most common contemporary use involves the success of science, particularly its success in identifying distinct kinds of things. Scientists often report discovering new kinds of things, a new species of mammal, a novel kind of fundamental particle, unquote. And so he also goes on to say this, which is pretty neat. they say, quote, excuse me, in the Western tradition, the concept of essential property dates back to Aristotle and enjoyed much fortune in the medieval and early modern philosophy and is still somewhat in vogue, unquote. So he rightly admits that its view is still around with us, and many want to take biological essentialism and twist it a little to kind of make it fit with evolution, whereas I'm saying, let's go with our intuition, go with biological essentialism in the traditional sense, and jettison the evolution. I have another paper here that's pretty neat. It's called Pattern Cladism, Homology, and Theory Neutrality by Christopher Pearson, published in History and Philosophy of the Life Sciences. And cladistics basically is a method of classifying animals and plants based on those common characteristics. So, what do they have to say? There's Colin Patterson. You might could say he's the father of pattern cladistics, and that's where we can take or leave the evolution assumption and just look at the key features that they have in common. Let's say raising eyebrows, we've narrowed it down to a dog or human, okay? That sort of thing. So, here's a quote. There was a conflict between Patterson's view and John Beatty's view. And despite a small enthusiastic group of opponents from within biology, pattern cladism has made subject to a pointed philosophical criticism from John Beatty. Beatty's critique rests on the charge that pattern cladism implicitly accepts essentialism. Essentialism we will understand here as the thesis that a class is defined according to a distinct set of essential properties, each member of the class having to possess the entire set in order to be a member of the class. Historically, essentialism has proved an attractive thesis and accounts recognized categories in the sciences, particularly in case of natural kinds. So those are the key things that you want to look at when you're studying this. And he goes on to say, and while there may be legitimate disagreement on the virtue of the theory of neutrality, there can be little dissent over the vice of a classificatory scheme that is theory antagonistic, particularly when that theory is as well established as evolutionary theory. Even more, despite pattern cladists' purported self-alienation from evolutionary theory, that self-alienation comes in the form of denying its status as a classifying principle, not in the form of denying the content and implications of that theory, unquote. So they're saying that pattern cladism takes a different approach, but they're not denying Darwinism altogether. Now, there was a very famous speech that Colin Patterson gave in 1981, and he made some amazing statements. Here are some of them. Then I woke up and I realized that all my life I had been duped into taking evolutionism as revealed truth in some way. Then he goes on. Those of us here at Hennig's meeting, and Hennig is the father of cladistics, in Ann Arbor last month may have heard both Ron Brady and I, and without any prior collusion quoted the same statement. That statement was, the explanatory value of the hypothesis of common ancestry is nil. We attributed this statement to E.S. Russell's 1960 book, Form and Function. Thinking about it since then, I feel the effects of the hypothesis of common ancestry and systematics has not been merely boring, but not just the lack of knowledge. I think it has been positively anti-knowledge, unquote. So he's actually saying that that doesn't actually help because we're trying to focus on where these things come from and what is the basis based on the characteristics. Now, you might challenge me and say, okay, well, show us these essential types of life. I mentioned two earlier, horses and humans. But let's say a 3-year-old, take a math analogy, asked about a prime number that had a lot of digits. Well, how many digits? Well, 100 digits. Maybe more than 100 digits. Show me one. Well, to prove that to the 3-year-old, all I have to do is show one. So if I've shown one essential type of life, I've proven my point. So actually I have a number here, pretty big. Starts with 309 and ends with 123. Trying to keep it simple there. And it has 110 digits. It's a prime number. So to prove that there does exist a prime number with that many digits, all I have to do is bring you one. So I'll give you two examples of ETLs, horses and humans. So horses, the zebras, the donkeys, the three-toed horses, I'm lumping all those together so you have a basic kind. There's a little bit of variation to it. but they all focus around a central core of characteristics in humans. As Aristotle said, a rational animal. That's one way to bring it together. And I have another illustration I want to bring out. And this is a book, The Visual Miscellaneum, and it's pretty cool. It has a lot of neat pictures, way to graphically represent data. And it has a thing on origins, has all kinds of neat things. So it has a punctuated equilibrium, it has a deism, but it does not have biological essentialism, which is the basic alternative to Darwinism. Now, I'd like to bring out a quote from Patterson. You say, well, that's what he said in 1981. He's probably changed his mind. He's given this more thought. And in the second edition of his book, Evolution, he said this, quote, "Are we justified in making the leap from small-scale changes like the selection in peppered moss to large-scale results as the existence of elephants in oak trees? Some evolutionists have felt that the original appearance of birds and land animals requires innovations that cannot be satisfactorily explained by gradual small-scale changes. So they have supposed the major innovations arise in one step by large-scale macro-mutations. The main reason for inventing these macro-mutations is that some features of plants and animals can hardly be imagined arising in gradual steps. Intermediate steps seem to be useless or even harmful. What use are feathers unless they are proper feathers? What use is a lung that is half developed and cannot give you enough oxygen? How can the segmentation of an earthworm or a centipede arise bit by bit? An animal is either segmented or not." Unquote. So he's at least admitting to the challenges of evolution that have some strong aspects there. A professor at NYU, a philosophy professor, Laura Franklin Hall, has written a paper, Natural Kind as Categorical Bottlenecks, and she describes the different aspects of essentialism. Quote, "These differ on whether they are thought to be multiple, possibly cross-cutting types of natural kinds of a particular sort, such as multiple varieties of biological species, genealogical and morphological. Another choice point for the realists concerns the thesis of essentialism, the view that members of a natural kind have a real essence, perhaps a locus of de re modality. As I understand things, essentialism is not a requirement of realism itself, but rather reflects a particular way of spelling out the realist vision." So realism is what we see has an aspect, and what we observe has an aspect to the real world. So if I go to the botanical gardens and see a bunch of koi fish swimming around, there really are koi fish in the pond at the botanical gardens. It's not an illusion. And you may notice on my holding up my screen there is a book by Tom Wolfe. Well, his last book, The Kingdom of Speech, challenges Darwinism because it can't explain the origin of human language. And so he became a Darwin doubter late in life, the well-known journalist and writer Tom Wolfe. So give it some thought, and I would ask you to consider some of these questions here. Are all the animals in the zoo in the same cage? Do whales bury their dead? What if Darwin was wrong? And could biological essentialism be the true aspect of what we see in the biological realm? And in my book, Young Earth Science, there's a whole chapter on biological essentialism. Like I said, you can go to totalyouth.us and check it out. If you wish to contact me, it's just youngearthscience@yahoo.com, youngearthscience@yahoo.com. Appreciate that. And don't forget to make Earth young again. # make Earth young again. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.